Hey, and welcome everyone to this event. Again, I think this is the second session of today. My name is Thomas Maurer. I'm a cloud advocate at Microsoft. And in this presentation, we're going to talk about hybrid management using Azure Arc. Now, before I'm going to start and talk about Azure Arc, and again, we will cover a lot of different topics today in terms of like what we actually can do, because Arc is a big topic. I want to quickly tell, like, I often get asked, like, Thomas, what does a cloud advocate do, and what is a cloud advocate? And so, just very, very quickly, as a cloud advocate, we are part of the Azure engineering team, and we basically focus on creating content and delivering content like this presentation, but we also work for platforms like Docs and Microsoft Learn, for example, where we create different articles and learning modules, which are, by the way, great platforms if you want to learn about Azure or even other Microsoft topics. And the other big part, what we're doing, a second big pillar, what we're doing is gathering feedback. So we are looking out to communities and customers, and we want to know what is working for you and what is not working for you. So we can then go back to our engineering teams and speak about the different topics in importance to you, and actually be an advocate for you and for our customers inside Microsoft, so we can actually make our products better. So let's start with speak about Hybrid and Azure Arc. And before we dive into Azure Arc, and I promise you, I have a ton of demos ready for you. I think most of the session is just me showing you a little bit what you can actually do with Azure Arc. But before we do that, I want to quickly point out, why did we actually create Azure Arc, and what is it behind it, right? So we went out and had a look at like different customers' environments, and we see that their environments are getting increasingly complex, right? And you might work in IT, and in that case, you probably also know that this is happening. So we looked at it. What are the key main factors, or were some of the key main factors why this is happening? And so what we saw is that usually IT or developers or IT pros and so on, they manage and work with hundreds, if not thousands, of different applications. Some of these applications are really new applications, which are basically written in modern languages like .NET Core or other platforms. They use modern frameworks. They're serverless. They're based on PaaS service, containerized, and so on. However, obviously, a large chunk of applications are still like traditional applications running in virtual machines or even in physical servers. And IT needs to manage all of that, right? Like at one point, you need to be taking care of all of these different levels of applications. Another thing we can see is that a lot of IT companies have a diverse, when it comes to infrastructure, they have a big diversity. In terms of they have their own data centers, they probably have some stuff outsourced to hosters. They have branch offices, factories, shops, for example, or retail stores, if you will. They run their IoT devices or servers or just like some piece of software, which you also need to take care of. So there's a big chunk of things happening there as well. And again, IT needs to manage all of that. The other big part is multi-cloud. Now, this is a trend we see, that there's a lot of talks going about multi-cloud, and we can talk about obviously how much sense it makes. But we see that even if customers make a great choice and they go with Microsoft Azure, I'm a little bit biased here, they probably also use other cloud providers. And that can have multiple reasons. That can be that like certain departments already started leveraging other cloud providers, and they're not just going to move everything or migrate everything over, right? Because it will take time, it will take an investment to actually move that over, and often you end up in using maybe still keep using that. Another thing is that customers maybe like do that in a strategic decision, right? They say, okay, I want to have multiple cloud providers, or they just like one service way better at another cloud provider. And so they end up using multiple cloud providers. And again, you then start to actually go out and need to manage all of that, right? And it's like, if you have systems and applications and services running everywhere, you somehow need to find a way of managing these. And another way is like that you also want to probably use familiar services you use, and we will talk about that in just a bit, which you use, for example, in Azure, and you want to use them probably also on-prem in your own data center, or you want to use them at another cloud provider, because this is the service you are familiar with. And so that is where we want to address this. Now, last year at Microsoft Ignite in Orlando, we talked a lot about hybrid. That was actually when Azure Arc was the first time announced back then. And in the second keynote, directly after Satya Nadella, Jason Sanders, here in the picture, which is the engineering lead of all the Azure engineering teams, he's basically directly under Scott Guthrie in Cloud and AI, and he takes care of all the engineering which goes on for the Azure services. He went out and did a keynote on Azure, mostly on Azure Hybrid, right? And he brought up this slide where you can see that hybrid for us is not just a single product, right? I think that is very important. If you compare it to others, hybrid for us is really a set of different products and services and solutions, depending on what the customer needs, right? We are not saying, okay, look, if you want to do hybrid, this is the way to go. We understand that, like, if you're doing hybrid, you probably have different needs. In some cases, you need infrastructure, like cloud-inspired infrastructure, where we come actually with our Azure Stack portfolio, which is not just a single product anymore. It's really a family of products and solutions, if you will. We can talk about that in a bit. Then, for example, also the whole IoT stuff. Like if you're going out and you want to work with like IoT devices, then you probably need some other solutions as well. And then obviously the big chunk we talked about, because this was pretty new, was the Azure Arc thing. And I'm going to explain to you what Azure Arc is really in detail in this session. Now, what a lot of people don't know is that Azure really was built up from the ground up to be hybrid, right? It's not something that we just like, okay, we started doing hybrid last year. Actually, we did hybrid with many of the services we had already for a long, long time, right? Because we saw that there's a need for customers to actually make their on-prem environment better by using hybrid services. So for example, if you think about, you see on the bottom line, you see things like management. So think about update management, think about security and identity with Active Directory and Azure Active Directory, think about data services with SQL Server, or DevOps tooling, like with Azure DevOps and Azure DevOps server. All that was already, there was a lot of hybrid capabilities in there. And we did just sometimes not a good job in telling customers how that actually works. Now, what I want to point out here is also one key reference Jason Sanders said. And he said that we believe hybrid is not just going to in-between state until everything is moved to the cloud. He said hybrid is going to be an end state for our customers, because we understand and that like customers, they cannot just use cloud for everything, right? But they can use cloud for some things, and then they can run other services at the edge or in their location. So that is what we understand there. And I think that is a very important part to understand, that we believe not that like everything going to move to the cloud. It's really about like bringing the cloud together with on-prem, with other cloud providers, with the edge, as we call it. So that is a very, very big key factor. Now, so let's have a look before we dive into the Arc thing, like what we actually all offer. So in Azure Hybrid, as I talked about, let's start on the bottom right here. I'm not going to talk too much about IoT because, again, we could talk for days about Azure IoT solutions. But IoT is obviously a big part of our hybrid strategy. And then in the middle, you can see our Azure Stack portfolio. Again, it's not just a single product anymore. It's now a set or a family of products or portfolio of products and solutions with Azure Stack Hub, which is the original Azure Stack, which allows you to basically bring your own instance of Azure Resource Manager for the portal in a location where you, for example, can't really have Azure, but you want to use Resource Manager templates, for example. You want to use the consistent portal experience, right? So that is what Azure Stack Hub enables you. Then we have Azure Stack Edge, which is a first-party appliance which you can order to run, for example, AI at the edge and do some fast computing processing, and then later on send data, for example, to Azure. And then we have our new, well, kind of like new announced version 2 of Azure Stack HCI, which is our hyper-converged infrastructure solution, which is like with cloud-inspired hardware where you can have it for different sizes, from very small deployments like 2-node deployments up to high performance 16-node deployments or high capacity 16-node deployments, and then obviously have multiple of those. And then moving on, the goal was, and I mentioned that before, is not just to like give customers our Azure services, but also give them our Azure services on any infrastructure, right? So we heard from many customers that, hey, they really like our service, like for example, Azure SQL, but they cannot use it in, for example, the Azure region, like can have like latency issues, right? That the cloud region is too far away, or they can have data sovereignty challenges there where they can't put the data outside of the country, for example, or something like that. So we want to enable the customers can actually go out and use these services, like, for example, Azure SQL managed instances, wherever they need it on basically any infrastructure. So that is also something where Azure Arc comes in, right? We like if you then want to run services, like again, I mentioned Azure SQL before. If you want to run that on your physical server in your data center, if you want to run it on your VMware infrastructure, on your Hyper-V infrastructure, on your at another cloud provider, you can do that as well. So that is one part where we leverage Azure Arc, is actually bring down these services. The other part is the middle line you can see here, the single control plane with Azure Arc, right? So this is actually a really powerful part. And let me talk a little bit about what that single control plane actually provides. Now, by the way, also feel free to ask your questions. I'm a little bit of monitoring the Q&A. However, I will also go through at the end, right, and give you some time at the end to ask your questions then as well. So going back, so what does that single control plane with Azure Arc actually means? It allows you to manage on-premises, multi-cloud, and edge environments. So basically everything where you want to need management, right? And we heard from our customers that they said, hey, Azure, and especially Azure Resource Manager, which is the magic behind all the organization part and inventory part and management part of Azure services, is great. And we love that to manage our Azure environment, right? But can we also manage services or servers or applications which are running outside of Azure? Because then we only need one solution. And that is actually where this control plane is going, right? So today we offer a couple of different things. You can then, with that control plane, you can actually see all your resources and organize and govern these resources at scale, as you can do with Azure services. You can then also adopt developer cloud practices on premises, right? So if you're like setting up with pipelines or GitOps and stuff like that, we want to bring that and enable that as well, right? Not that you can use your Kubernetes cluster, for example, for just in the cloud, but also use the same way of managing these, bring them on-prem, for example. And then implementing Azure security, right? So Azure obviously has a big set of security technologies to make your environment better, right? And make it more secure, especially when it runs in Azure. But we also want to extend that because, again, a customer environment doesn't stop with the cloud, right? It really goes further. It has, again, a lot of customers are running stuff in their own data center. And I think that is really the key. So instead of talking about it so much and just showing you slides, let's just jump into a demo. And I'm switching here to my Azure environment. And I hope most of you have already seen that. That is basically the Azure portal. Let me just zoom in a little bit more for you. I know it's big, but I hope you can actually see everything. I always hate when you can't see things. So here I'm all in the all resources page, right? So I can see all my Azure resources. And for those who are not so familiar with Azure, everything in Azure is basically an object, every resource. So for example, you can see here, I have automation accounts, I have virtual machines. So I can see here I have different resources, but also a resource could also be, for example, a public IP address, a firewall, a routing table, a database, or whatever. Everything is basically a resource, and every resource is part of a resource group. It's joined to an Azure location, and it's also part of an Azure subscription. And then I can use different tools here, like tags, for example, to manage these. And you can see here, I have a big list, but I can then use tools to filter that. Now, let me quickly do this. So instead of showing you all, making that a little bit more clear. So I'm going to search. So let's say I just want to see my Azure virtual machines, and I want to see my servers running outside of Azure, but I joined them already using Azure Arc. So what our customers were asking for, can I use the Azure management experience for example, servers or Kubernetes clusters or SQL databases outside of Azure? And so that is what we made possible with Azure Arc. So I'm going to select this. And now what you can see here is, you can see here I have all my Azure virtual machines, but also, if I scroll more down, my Azure Arc machines here. Right? So these are servers running outside of Azure, but they look like an Azure resource, and they are also joined to a resource group, to a region, to a subscription, and so on. You can also see here, I use tags to organize these resources as well, as same as I would do with Azure resources. So for example, I can tell, okay, this one is running in the New York data center, this one is running in the Seattle office. To be fair with you, they're basically all running underneath my desk here on my little lab system. So, but again, you get the point, right? And then you can do great things. We can also, for example, go out and say, hey, let's add another filter, because now I want to see, for example, I want to see all my sys servers, doesn't matter where they're running, from a specific cost center. So I have a tag for cost center, which I assign to my machines. So I'm going to select that, and then I'm going to see all my systems running in cost or for cost center 1001. And so I'm going to select that. And now you will be seeing that, again, you can now see that these are all the servers. These two servers are all the servers I'm running within that cost center. And you can see that one is running in Azure. That's the virtual machine here. And the other one here, which is an Ubuntu machine, that one, for example, here is running somewhere outside of Azure, right? This can be running at another cloud provider, or it can run in my own data center. Now, so this is pretty cool. Again, you can leverage that. You get now this overview, this inventory about all the resources in Azure. But you might say, Thomas, yeah, okay, now I get this inventory, right? And don't underestimate this. This is a huge challenge for a lot of companies to get actually an inventory about all their systems in their environment, right? To have that single pane of glass to actually view all of that. However, there's obviously more which we can do. So let me jump to home here. And what I want to show you here is Azure Policy. Now, I'm going to show you how you can actually leverage it with your servers running outside of Azure. So we're going to load here the policy page, and maybe some of you are already familiar with Azure Policy, but for those who are not, Azure Policy is actually a tool, if you will, to configure your Azure environment, right? So the cloud promises that you have a lot of speed and agility, and you can just go out and deploy resources, and everyone can just go and fire and all of that. However, sometimes you want to have a little bit more control over your environment, right? You don't want to block the speed of your environment. You want to keep control of it, but you don't want that every developer or IT pro goes out and creates the largest virtual machines out there. We have this great thing called the MV2 series virtual machines, which are for a couple of hundred cores, I think up to 12 terabyte of memory. And like they drain your credit card in like 3 seconds. So you don't want every developer going out to deploy this. Or you also want to make sure that, for example, all the resources are configured the right way, that they're running, for example, in the right Azure region, right? So if your company operates in Europe, you'll probably want to use the Azure regions in Europe for most of the stuff. And you want to keep that data there. So Azure Policy gives you a way to configure your Azure environment. Now, what a lot of people don't know, there is also something to extend this, and that is called Azure Guest Configuration Policies. With Azure Guest Configuration Policies, we can extend these policy settings to operating systems running in Azure virtual machines, right? So we can do operating system settings on the operating and audit these virtual machines. And I'm going to show you that in a bit. So think about it as like group policies on steroids, right? So you can actually go out and manage that, not just for Windows machines, also for Linux machines as well. So what you would do is basically you would go to assignments, and if the thing is fast enough, I can go and basically go and create a policy assignment or an initiative assignment. An initiative assignment is just a group basically of multiple policies to make it easier. And then, so what I'm going to select here, I could obviously select the scope. I can say, okay, this is going to be on a management group, on a subscription level, on a resource group level. I can even put it down to one specific resource and configure that. And then I'm going to select the definition. And you can see here, if I go to built in, you can see we give you already a couple of different policies actually and definitions to do things. There's some of them are like technical in a way that, well, they're all at the end doing something technical, but like, okay, I want to have this specific settings. However, we also have very many of those are like certification specific. So if you're dealing with PCI, for example, scrolls here a little bit. We have one for PCI, for example, as well. So this then takes in account like the different settings you need to get that certification. You can also see, I think we have one for ISO and many others like UK official and UK NHS and so on. However, in my case, I just want to do a simple check, and I want to do an audit of my machines with insecure password settings. So I want to know if my servers, Linux and Windows, have insecure password settings, right? So I want to be aware of that. So I can take now this policy and I could go and create that and assign it. However, like in a good cooking show, I already prepared this because this will then obviously take some time until every server is audited. So I already created an assignment. And if I want to know more how I'm doing, I can go to compliance. And I wouldn't be able to see here all my assignments. Just a second until it loads. You can see here, I'm not doing a really good job here because I'm pretty much non-compliant. So I want to know a little bit more. And here in the bottom, you can see here that I have some where I'm compliant. But then if I'm lucky enough and scroll down far enough, you can also see some of them where I'm actually compliant and I'm all doing great. But I'm more interested in ones I'm not doing so much. So here is my policy, which I already assigned. The same thing I just showed you, checking insecure password settings within Azure virtual machines operating systems, right? So if I scroll down here, I can then see what settings actually, and you can see that I'm not compliant in general, but you can also then figure out, okay, to which rules, what settings I'm actually not compliant with, right? So I can see if maybe it's a common setting which says, okay, this is on all my machines, the same thing. Now, what I'm even more interested in is the non-compliant resources. Now, we can now see here my Azure VMs, which are not compliant with that, right? But with Azure Arc, you can also see now here my Microsoft Hybrid compute machines. So these are servers. You can see here, this is even called on-prem server 01, a machine which runs outside of Azure. And I can use the same policies to make sure that my machines are audited in the right way, right? So I think that is pretty cool. And I will show you a little bit more how that works in just a bit. But I think that is a very important part here. So let me switch back to the slides quickly. I want to explain to you what we just saw in a little bit more or in an architectural way. So here we have a slide which shows a high-level overview from the Azure management experience. And no worries, we're going to go through a little bit in a more simple way. So let's start on the left side. So when we are interacting with Azure, we as Azure customers, we're using tools like the Azure portal, PowerShell, Bash, the CLI, APIs, the marketplace, third-party tools, and so on. And what we're actually doing is we are connecting and working with Azure Resource Manager. And I mentioned it before, Azure Resource Manager is basically the magic behind all of this when it comes, for example, to the whole management experience. So for example, think about role-based access controls, logs, subscription management, the policy part, the tags I showed you, the search, the indexing, and so on. All of that is done by Azure Resource Manager. That is basically the piece which you have. On the top, you can also see we have a couple of management services like monitoring, update, containers, backup, security centers, which we can leverage as well. And then before we announced Azure Arc, Azure Resource Manager really was designed to manage our Azure services, right? So we could go out and manage our Azure VMs, our Kubernetes clusters, our web apps, our databases as a service, our logic apps, whatever Azure service there have been, we basically use the Azure Resource Manager to manage that. And I know if you have worked with Azure for a long time, you probably also know the days before we actually had Azure Resource Manager, which now Azure Resource Manager, again, gives a lot of benefits. Now, what we are doing with Azure Arc, we're going to extend that. So that was a wish from our customers. They said, hey, Azure Resource Manager and these Azure management services, they are so great. I want to use them for not just my Azure services, but also for services and servers and other things running outside of Azure. And so that is what we did. So with Arc, we are extending the Azure Resource Manager to allow our customers to onboard resources living outside of Azure. Today, these are servers. I will show you most of the things with Linux and Windows servers today. However, there's also Kubernetes clusters. So if you run Kubernetes clusters in your own data center at your branch office or at another cloud provider, you can do that too. You can also add your SQL servers to it to be managed. And then we also provide you with something called the Azure Data Services, which actually allow you to deploy Azure SQL wherever you need it, and other Azure services as well. So I'm going to talk about that in just a bit. But you can see here, Azure Arc now basically bridges the resources outside of Azure to Azure Resource Manager. And I hope you heard and see what I did there. So let me show you a little bit about Azure Arc and how that actually works, because now I showed you, okay, what happens if a server and services are already joined, but how do I actually get there? So if you're in the Azure portal, you can, for example, use the search functionality to go to Azure Arc, right? So you can go and type Azure Arc here, then select Azure Arc, and then you come to the newly designed, basically Azure Arc Center, if you will, where you actually manage all the things you want to attach to Azure Arc. Now, this was basically redesigned at Ignite this year. This is our online event, I think back in September, if I'm counting that correctly. And you get some more information about how you get started, about infrastructure, about data services. And you can see here what I just mentioned, right? You can add existing infrastructures like servers and Kubernetes clusters to manage them. Or you can, for example, deploy Azure Data Services anywhere on your infrastructure, right? And again, this is just where this is going. You can also then see, and we will go through on these things a little bit on the left side. You can see here I can list all my Arc services. So if I do that, I'm basically seeing everything I already joined. And again, this can be not just servers. Most of my things here are servers, but you can also see I have a Kubernetes cluster here, which I joined to Azure. You can also see here from the type, it's a Kubernetes cluster joined using the Arc. I also have a SQL server here. One time it's like just this operating system, and the other time it's really just the SQL server instance, if you will. And then there's much, much more. So if you go to the left side, I can just go to the single resources, so servers, Kubernetes clusters, SQL servers, and then the data controllers. This is when you deploy a Azure SQL managed instance, you will deploy a data controller, which then gives you the flexibility to, for example, scale and do all of that of the Azure SQL instance. But I will talk about that in a bit. And then Also, if you're familiar with the Azure Stack HCI, which before I announced it, Azure Stack HCI is connected to Azure using Azure Arc. So Azure Stack HCI has Azure Arc already built in, and actually connects up to Azure to make sure that you can do the management, that we can give you some extra features from Azure. So that is pretty cool. Now, you probably ask, okay, so how do I get a server or a Kubernetes cluster in there? And it's pretty simple. It's done by an agent. So if I go to server, again, I will have a list of all my servers here. But if I want to add one, I have this add button. So again, what we're going to do is we're going to take an agent and install that on the server where we want it. And that server then has an outgoing connection using port 443. So it's encrypted connection to the Azure API. And there's nothing incoming what you need to do, right? Really, it's just outgoing traffic from that server. So if I want to do that, you can obviously read the documentation about how to download that agent and registering it, but we wanted to make it easy. So we give you that add button here, which will open up a wizard. And you can have, like right now, we offer like two methods, if you will, to add servers. One is running an interactive script. This script really you can download it, you can run it against the machine, and then while you're running it, you need to actually log in with your Azure account, right? And then register that server to Azure. Now, if you want to onboard that at scale with multiple servers and you want to probably automate that process, that is not a good way of doing it. Then you would do the solution where you can add service at scale. And then we have an option here with like service principal names, which only have the permission to join service to Azure Arc. So we have that very low permission service principal, which we then can leverage and run in a script against. So, but for demo sake, I'm going to show you a little bit like that you understand how the script looks like. So you're going to generate that interactive script because this is where we have this nice wizard. So first, it again tells us about the prerequisites when we want to join an Azure Arc resource. And again, this is the same kind of like scenario for Kubernetes clusters and others as well, but I'm going to show you the part with the servers. And again, this works obviously with Linux and Windows servers, physical and virtual machines as well. So again, it needs accessing port 443, outgoing traffic. We also have documented like specific URLs which we need to connect to. You need to obviously have local administrator permission, so that server wants to install that agent. Good. So if we then go out and we want to join the resource, we obviously need to join this because it will be treated like an Azure resource. So it will be in a subscription. It will be part of a resource group. So I'm going to select one. I already have here. I have one created one. Then I will select the Azure region. Now, obviously that system is not running in Azure region, but at one point I need to store some metadata information and I need to like select the APIs to which region the agent actually connects. Now, we offer here a couple of regions, but again, this is only metadata where the metadata is going. So for us, we will take Western Europe. And again, we are adding more regions all the time, depending on our customers' needs. I can also select what server kind do I want to join, right? Is this a Windows machine or a Linux machine? That then obviously changes the script which I use to run on the machine, right? I cannot necessarily run a PowerShell script on every Linux machine and vice versa. So in that case, we're going to join a Windows machine. I can also, with the service behind the proxy, I can also configure proxy. And then you can see here, I can already, before actually joining the server, I can already configure tags for that system. We already have a couple of them, which we tell you these are like good ones to use, for example, but you can obviously use your own ones. You can always do that later. Right? There's no thing you need to do that right now. You can always configure tags later, but we want to make it as easy as possible. So at the end, you then basically get this script, and the script basically goes out and it does download the agent, which in the Windows world is an MSI file. It then installs that agent, and then the last one, it basically goes out and registers my agent to the specific tenant, to the specific subscription, to the specific resource group. So it actually shows up in the right way on that machine. So this is how I join a Azure Arc resource. And then after a couple of minutes, basically, the server will show up here. And you will be able to actually go out and manage that server here. Now, what can we do, right? I showed you a little bit of the inventory part. I showed you like the general policy part. So if I'm managing my whole environment, I would be going to the policy part and actually see all my policies across my environment. Now, but for some parts, I want to use role-based access control, right? So I want to have just manage the server. So in this case, let's have a look at one of these Azure Arc servers here. And again, you get similar experiences with other Azure Arc services like Kubernetes clusters and others, right? But I'm going to show you how that, for example, looks for a server, because I think that's the most common thing people are using. So everyone understands how servers are working. So as you can see here, it looks like a Azure resource, right? We get some information here, which resource group it is, which location it has for the metadata. You can see here there's a description it's joined. You can also see here that I already used tags. I said, okay, this one is running another cloud provider, for example, for the location tag. And this one is also part of the cost center I'm in. You get also some specific information about the server. You can see which operating system I'm running. You see also the computer name or the FQDN. So you can see here, this is a local Active Directory domain even. You can see here the agent version I'm running now, the Azure Arc agent version, and so on. If we move to the left side, we can see here like the typical Azure features like the activity log, the tags, but again, also very important, the access control. Like, so think about it. If you have now SharePoint servers running on-prem or another cloud provider, whatever, you probably don't want to give everyone access to these SharePoint servers. You only want to give the SharePoint team access to these servers. So you can configure that as you can do with role-based access control for Azure machines. And then we come to the interesting part where, okay, Thomas, we can do much, much more here. So we have some settings here. So one thing I want to show you, we can, for example, go and deploy extensions. So if you're familiar with Azure VMs, there's something called VM extensions, which give you some additional tooling. So we can go out and add an extension. So what we can do is we can run a custom script against that machine. And here it automatically obviously detected that this is a Windows server. Again, this also works definitely with Linux servers as well. You can also use PowerShell desired state configuration, or you can go and deploy the log analytics agent. So I already have done that. You can see here, I already deployed the monitoring agent here. So I have that deployed, and that works quite fine. I also get some security information here. Because I did this, I can now get recommendations from Azure Security Center. So I now get here some security recommendation. I can see here that this server, for example, does not have a vulnerability assessment solution enabled. And there's a couple of other things which I can actually go out and figure out, okay, what is the problem? I can also see if there would be like updates which would not have been installed, and so on. So I get these recommendations here for security-wise. Now, with that, I get also obviously some monitoring insights. So what I can do here, I can open up Insights, and I get our monitoring solution here. So the first thing I want to show you here is the map, the dependency map I get. So bear with me here. So I can see here that my server, this is my server, has different processes which connect to different endpoints, right? So I zoom in here. So I have a couple of endpoints or servers I'm connecting to, and I can actually want to have a look, where is this server connecting to? So I get a list here of these endpoints where that server is connecting to. So I can see, okay, what are all the outgoing ports? Now these were mostly external things, but here, if I go scroll down, for example, and zoom in here, you can also see that that server connects to a domain controller here using port 135, right? So you can see here, like all the dependencies from that server, which is actually super interesting, like if you're managing servers or if you're troubleshooting things and so on. With the monitoring part, you also get obviously the performance monitoring, which is actually helps us, like we get some disk performance information, like how much space is left. We get CPU utilization. You can see here this server doesn't do that much. Available memory, IOPS, disk IOPS, disk throughput, and so on, disk latency. All that information, we can actually look at it now here, centralized in Azure for each of the servers we have joined. We also get logs. So this server is now deployed with log analytics. So let me quickly, oops. No, I have no idea what I clicked on. Oops. Sorry about that. Close this. That's when you click too fast, because I just wanted to click on this one. So here I can use Azure, like Azure Log Analytics, right? So you probably say, Thomas, we could use that before. Yes, that was absolutely true. So you could like join a server to Azure Log Analytics. However, the challenge with that was always that, like, when you wanted to give someone access to the logs in Azure Log Analytics, you actually needed to give them access to the whole Log Analytics workspace. Now with Azure Arc, you can like limit that to a specific server. So this, now when I'm admin only for this server, I only get the logs for that specific server. So you can see I only have access to the scope of WAC. Now, here, then, I can use the keyword query language. Many of you probably remember that as Custo. It's the same thing. I can run queries. I have a very simple one here, which gives me the update summaries. So I can actually go through the logs, and now I get the update summaries and can see, okay, are there updates missing? What is missing? And so on. I get all this information. But however, as you can see, this is just not just works with obviously this logs. It also works with system logs, with your security logs, like basically all the event logs in the Windows world. Then also for the obviously the same thing works also for in the Linux world. Now, okay, this is great, but we want to have some more tools. So one thing I showed you was policy. So with policy, I showed you how you can like look all your policies in your Azure environment across a whole environment, across all your servers and systems and apps. Now in this view, I only see the policies which are assigned to my specific server, right? So I only see that these are the policies which are affecting WAC 01. So if I'm the admin of that server, I can actually see, okay, to which company-wide policies I'm not compliant with. And you can see here I have like 3 of them, or 4 of them, which I'm not compliant. And I have here a couple of them which I'm compliant. And I obviously don't care about the ones right now which I'm compliant, but here I can see, okay, what policy am I not compliant with? So I click on that one, and I can automatically see already the title that this audits Windows VMs that are not set to a specific time zone, right? So I can see, okay, what is going on? I get some more information here, and then I can see here where I'm not compliant. Obviously, here I would just see my specific resource here. I can now go and fix that, right? I could go manually to that server and see why the server does not have a specific time zone and change it. But I can also create a remediation task. So if I click on this, I can basically go and say, hey, yep, I acknowledge that, and I would go and fix that, right? I also get some other tools here. So I get, for example, change tracking. So I can enable that. Again, this is a service, by the way, we had for a long time, but not a lot of people know about this. And it also worked in a hybrid environment for a long time. So you can see here all the changes happening to that specific system. So you can see that there was software installed, that some services changed. You can filter that. You can find that for all the services here. I also want to quickly highlight that button. I will show you that in a bit, like manage multiple machines. Right now, we obviously see that only for this machine. We also get an inventory. Same thing here. We see all the different inventories of software installed. So what is installed in that machine? You can see here this one has, for example, the Azure Arc connected machine agent installed, which makes a lot of sense. But you can also see that this server here, for example, also has Microsoft Edge installed, right? So I installed Edge on that. So I can actually go and see what is running on that. I can also figure out like what services are on that machine and what are running and what are stopped and so on. Now, I showed you policy, which allowed you to do things. But now let's say one of the biggest challenges we see is like managing updates, right? A lot of people like know that managing updates can be a pain, especially about cross different environments. So if I click on update management, I already enabled this for this server. So I can now see like all the missing updates. You can see here I'm missing 4 updates. And one of them is a security update, which you probably should install. And the other ones are like definition updates, which are less critical, if you will. Now, let's fix this, right? I know now that these updates are missing, but I want to fix this. So what I can do is I can schedule an update deployment for that server. I can give that a name. So let's call that WEC to update. What do we have today? Today, for example, whatever the name makes sense for you. It already detects that this is a Windows machine. Obviously, again, cannot stress this enough. Also works with Linux machines. And then I can define, okay, the length of the maintenance window to install the updates. And then what should I do afterwards? Should I always reboot, never reboot, or for example, reboot if the updates require a reboot? Which is also, by the way, interesting setting is like only reboot. I can just also go out and just reboot and update a server, right? That's really also pretty cool. But most cases for installing, it's just reboot if required. That makes a lot of sense. And then you can go out and schedule this. So I can obviously now say update now, which will then trigger the update in the next 5 to 10 minutes, and it will go out. However, since I'm doing a presentation, it's probably not the right time to do that. And also, like if you have production machines, it's probably not the right time to do that during work hours. So what I can do is I can go out and schedule this. I can give it time, start date, and so on, obviously, depending on time zones. And then I can also make this a recurring task. So if I want to, for example, I can do that weekly or daily or monthly and configure that. When should these updates run on this machine? So I can automatically let that patch every Tuesday night or something like that. I can also add some more granular options to install updates. So in the Windows world, we obviously have these classifications. So we can select these different classifications we want to install. So if I don't say I only want to install critical updates or security updates, I can do that and leave everything out. I can also exclude and include updates. I can run a pre and a post script if I want to. And then at the end, I just create that task. I'm not going to create that now again, but that was just to show. Now, what I want to see now, you don't have to do that for every single machine. If you're not familiar with Azure Update Management, we had that for a long time. So if I click on Manage Multiple Machines, I will jump to that management service. Like I did show you before, the Azure Policy at the beginning, where I see all the policies across my environment. I'm now in the Azure Automation account, where I have a solution called Update Management. And here, I can see all my servers I joined to Update Management. And you can see here, my Azure VMs, as well as my non-Azure VMs. And you can see that some of them are compliant, some of them are not. And I could actually go out and manage these. I can also add new Azure VMs. I can also configure it that new Azure VMs are automatically joined, and so on. I can also find out all the missing updates across my environment. And now I could also go and schedule an update deployment, but this time not just for a single server, but let's say we do it for a group of servers. So I could select multiples, or I can create a dynamic group, like for example, which is very smart, usually like based on tags. So for example, I say I create a tag called update group, and I give it update group 1 and create update servers which are an upgrade group 2. So for example, if you have two domain controllers, one is in upgrade group 1 and the other one is in upgrade group 2. So upgrade group 1 will be patched on Tuesdays, and upgrade group 2 will be patched on Thursdays, for example. So you can actually do some very smart things in terms of update management, again, with Windows and Linux machines. Now, the last thing I want to show you in this quick demo is, again, I want to show you what you actually can do with SQL servers. So I know many of you probably run SQL Server on-prem, but also in Azure. So this one is now running on-prem. And if I click on it, what I get here is some additional security information, right? I take the power of Azure Security Center and extend that to my SQL configuration. So this is a SQL server I installed on one of my local machines here. And now I get a lot of recommendations what I could do better. This can be simple from like updates which are not installed, but also from configuration side of things. Like there's like no endpoint security installed, and I think there's also some even more specific things which we can have a look at. Then also we get some more logs here. I'm not going too deep into that, but we can also get some environment health here as well. In that SQL assessment, so we can actually find out, is my SQL server configured the right way? Okay, so enough demo right now. Let's jump back to the slides. We have a couple of minutes left, I think. And I see that there's one question coming in. I will take that at the end, so bear with me here. So let me quickly give you a quick overview about the takeaways of what I just showed you. And again, I showed you mostly the Azure Arc enabled servers part. However, there is that you can think that this works similarly for all the services like Azure Kubernetes, Azure Arc enabled Kubernetes clusters, or Azure Data Service, and so on. So first of all, we get obviously an inventory for Windows and Linux machines, physical and virtual machines, running in your own private data center or at another cloud provider or at the edge, in your retail store, in your factory, wherever it's running, completely domain agnostic. You get some additional governance and security tools. You get Azure Policy, you get security baselines, you get security recommendations from Azure Security Center. You can go out and audit these servers. You also get role-based access control. So this one is interesting. Again, like you get obviously an overview. I can, like as I said before, you can, for example, the SharePoint admins, they can only see their SharePoint servers, for example. If you have another application, they can only see their application if you want to. So you can really do that like only for the specific people. Now, what I want to highlight in that, if you're a managed service provider, you can also use Azure Lighthouse together with Azure Arc. So if you have multiple customers with multiple Azure AD tenants, I highly recommend that you have a look at Azure Lighthouse if you haven't. This gives you this single management experience over across multiple Azure tenants. But Azure Arc also works with that pretty well. And then obviously you get some organizational tasks, things I showed you at the beginning. You get a searchable inventory. You get like be able to use tags. You can easily like tell like if your boss comes to you and says, "Hey, I want to have an overview. How many servers do we have? How many, like, what's the patch status? What is like, which cost center do they belong to?" You can really quickly go into the Azure portal. You can, by the way, I showed you most of the things in the Azure portal, but you obviously can also use Azure PowerShell. You can use the Azure CLI. They also have functionality for that. You can use Azure Resource Graph to actually see more about that. So I talked mostly about server, as I mentioned, but there are more use cases. So one of the use cases, as I mentioned, is organizing and govern your environment. Again, this works for servers, but also for Kubernetes clusters. In the same way, you can make sure that your Kubernetes cluster is configured in the right way, that there are no ports open, which doesn't need to be open. So you can make sure it's secured. You also get app management at scale. So think about it. If you want to like deploy your applications, containerized applications on your Kubernetes clusters, wherever they're running, you can configure them. If they are Arc enabled, you can configure that deployment directly from Azure. And then you can link a Git repository where actually the configuration is in there. And as soon as you do a change to that, it can be deployed to these Kubernetes clusters where you manage that. Very, very powerful. And then the last one, I was speaking about that a lot. Again, customers told us that they love, for example, our data services, especially Azure SQL managed instances. But for some reason, they can't run it in an Azure region because it's too far away, for example, or they have some compliance reasons as well. In that case, they can go out and deploy Azure data services. Now, I also quickly want to talk about that. So Azure Arc enabled servers. So the server part, that is GA, general availability. You can like go out and use it. You get production support. We also talk about costs in just a bit, because I know that this question always comes up. The Kubernetes part, as well as the data services part, that is still in preview. So it's in public preview, so you can go and try it out. It's currently free because it's public preview. So you can see if that works for you without cost involved, and you can see if that actually works in that sense. Again, if you use additional management services like Azure Log Analytics, for example, you will definitely pay for that, right? Just keep that in mind. But the Arc services, also for Azure Arc enabled service, Azure Arc enabled service is basically free. So if you join a server, you have no cost basically involved. But as soon as you then enable some of the management features like the logs part or the monitoring part and so on, then there will be some added cost for the logs, for example. But there's no general cost for the Azure Arc enabled servers part to just join the server. So if you just want to try it out, just go ahead and try it. I also want to quickly give you, like, because I know some of you are very technical, so I want to give you a high-level architecture view of Azure Arc to like summarize what I just showed you. And so again, we start on the left side. If we are working with Azure, we're basically using the portal, CLI, PowerShell APIs, the Azure SDK, and we're interacting with Azure Resource Manager. And now in blue, you can see all the Azure Arc enabled things. So what we have is what we call the resource providers. So Azure, basically every Azure service more or less has a resource provider, which is basically the functionality. And then you have, for example, in the bottom, you can see here we have an agent for the server, which connects then to that resource provider. If you look at the middle part, a Kubernetes cluster works the same way. You have an agent on the Kubernetes cluster, which then connects to the resource provider. And then the same thing for the data service control. Now, what I also want to mention is Azure Data Services. Like today, we offer Azure SQL Managed Instance and Postgres. And these, the prerequisites to run these services is actually just a Kubernetes cluster. So if you want to run Azure Data Services, what you need is a Kubernetes cluster somewhere, and you can actually put it there because the whole service, the whole design of it is containerized. I also want to highlight, we don't want to create dependencies on the cloud or your internet connection. So you can still use, and in many cases it makes sense to use your local management tools, like your server admin tools, your Azure Data Studio, for example. You can directly connect to your Azure SQL Managed Instance running in your data center. You don't need to go through Azure or something like that. And same thing for your Kubernetes clusters as well. So again, quickly going back, making another step back. Again, this Azure Arc is only one of our hybrid solutions, right? We have a lot of different ones, like the Azure Stack family, the IoT suite, and a lot of management services and other things around it. A lot of questions always I get is like, is this thing, do I still, like, if I have Azure Arc, do I still need an Azure Stack? And again, it depends, right? So these are solving different business needs. In some cases, you need an Azure Stack, like you need some infrastructure. In other cases, you need Azure Arc. In some cases, you need both. We want both of them, right? You want to put, like, you combine them. So this is really, really great. You can, depending on really what the customers need, there are different hybrid services, not just containers or not just VMs. It's really like bringing all of that together. So with that, I really want to say thank you. I know that there's one question. I will quickly go through that. But I really, for everyone else, I want to say thank you very much for joining this session. Again, you can reach out to me on Twitter or on my blog if you have any questions. So one question I saw here in the thing was, is it possible to set policies based on a pool of IP addresses or resources software installed in a VM? So what you want is like, okay, you want to see what, like, okay, if a server has this installed, then it should be configured like that. Yes. So with these policies, you can actually create your own policies. There is a GitHub repository with a lot of more policies, not just the built-in ones, but you can create your own policies. And then obviously you can have your own, like, if statements, if you will, kind of, to figure out, okay, if the state is this, I want it to be this. And then you can say, okay, that then you're compliant or not compliant. And obviously you can say, if, for example, it's in a pool of IP addresses, or it's, if, for example, that software is installed, it should not be installed. So we have, for example, one rule is like, where we can go out and see if a specific agent is installed. And we can say if that agent isn't installed, then you're not compliant. And if it is installed, you're compliant. We obviously can also do that the other way around, right? But depending on your needs. So you can create your own ones. So that is definitely very, very, very powerful. I hope I answered that question. Again, there's a lot of like Azure Guest Configuration Policy, and Azure Policy in general is a very, very powerful tool. So again, with that, I want to say thank you very much for your time. I hope you enjoyed that session. Again, if you want to read more about it, check out my blog. There's a search functionality. Search for Azure Arc. You will find a ton of information and also links to the official documentation as well. It was a pleasure to speak at this Uptime 2020, and I hope you enjoy the rest of this event. Thank you very much.